Let us pray. O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, you our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. As I was driving here this morning, before I begin my sermon, I wanted to encourage you, if you have time today when you get home, to listen to the podcast for the CBC conversation that happened with Jim Wallace today at 9 a.m. I was late in getting into it, but I found it provocative on how it informs what I'm speaking about today. And Jim Wallace was talking about the Jesus movement that's getting underway, especially in the States, and in particular as it relates to the ego of not that egos aren't good. Egos are good things to have, by the way. But if you have the ego of some people, it's not helpful for a whole wide number of reasons. And it resonated in the way that it was speaking to me about how important it is for us, especially at this time of year, to empty ourselves. This past week, I was wondering to myself, could you imagine singing a Magnificat of your own making? I wonder how are hope, peace, and joy and love being birthed in you in this time of year? How is the Spirit moving within you such that in the new year, perhaps your soul may ever more fully magnify the Holy One in this world? Mary's song, often called the Magnificat, is a welcomed contrast to the hyped-up speed of the commercialism that is too often the dominant theme in our culture during Advent season. Mary's lyrics are an invitation for us to approach Christmas with a slower and more contemplative space. This morning's reading from Luke's Gospel presents Mary, mother of Jesus, joyously proclaiming that her soul magnifies the Lord. This is Mary's song, the Magnificat. It's just recently that I learned that this passage represents the longest uninterrupted passage by a woman in the whole Bible. An interesting feature of Luke's Gospel is that Mary sings her chorus after the male voice, represented by John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, who had been silenced. You may remember Zechariah. He had been struck mute because of his unbelief. So contrast this with Mary, who believed that all things could be possible with the Holy One, and she consented to the presence of God. This consent took the form of Mary's willingness to become a vessel for the birth of the Christ. Now, it may be that the Christmas predisposition is distinctively feminine. The masculine impulse to make something happen, to us to engineer life, to make one's mark, is suspended temporarily to make room for the feminine archetype in both women and men, for it to emerge. So we move into this receptive mode with Mary, mind you, and it's not passive, it's actively receptive. Mary is a vessel of God. Now you need to understand that vessels by definition are empty. The very purpose of jugs or of basins or of barrels, for example, is to become a holding place for something. Vessels enjoy a state of emptiness, and it is that very emptiness that makes them functional. Mary's womb, is a symbol of this kind of emptiness. Her empty womb makes space to be filled with the life of God. She exemplifies a fecund or a creative emptiness, a habitat for the incubation of a divine creativity symbolized by the birth of the Christ. In Advent, the season of the church year leading up to Christmas, the challenge is the same. Making space, creating emptiness, so that the Holy One might be born in and through you and I. So how are you doing with that project this year? It's not easy, is it? You come to church, and the preacher is encouraging you to empty out, to make room for the divine. And then you leave church, and every radio, TV, or newspaper or advertisement is screaming at you to fill yourself up with something more. More parties, more presents, more preparations, more dinners, well, more just about of everything. I remember many of those Christmas dinners having to loosen my belt and push back the chair from the table and solemnly declare that I had no room for dessert. But I often wonder, is there any room at all in our lives left for the sacred? Or are our bellies, or our agendas, or our heads already full of just about everything else even imaginable? You see, I believe we all have a hollowed space in our soul that is reserved for the Holy One. But we tend to confuse busyness with significance, and we end up stuffing ourselves on everything else that the world we live in has to offer. You see, the ego's project is the polar opposite of the Christmas project. The ego, by which I simply mean that unenlightened part of ourselves, exists to get stuffed. It really does. You and I stuff ourselves on knowledge, on wealth, on status, on experience, expertise, friends, booze, food, and exercise. The ego thinks that the empty space in our soul is supposed to be just filled with more and more. And it confuses the state of being crammed full of stuff with significance. By it, of course, I mean we. Now, my own theory about this is that the unhealthy part of us, the alienated ego, is fearful that it is a temporary, transient structure and wants to have some kind of eternal status in life, like the soul. But it doesn't really trust that it participates in this eternal status, and so it's always looking for more stuff to bulk up on in an effort to feel more substantial, more lasting, and more important. Like a Donald Trump. Now, the ego isn't the metaphysical bad guy here. It's not necessary to don a white hat or run the ego out of town. Too many expressions of spirituality, in fact, do exactly this. But just try getting through your life without a strong and competent ego. It's like the closet organizer of our psyche, talking and taking all those various bits of our life and fashioning a tidy sense of self, giving us some kind of an identity. You want that identity, friends, because the psych wards are filled with poor souls who are lacking good, solid, functional egos. But it's the unhealthy ego in us I'm talking about. Because even here, the goal is not to get rid of it, but to help it get with the spiritual program in life. and the insights of all mystical traditions of every single faith in this world is that the way to get with the program is to put it in to a service that has some higher purpose of living our lives. That's why we often see the testosterone-filled professional football players go down on one knee and point to the skies after they score a touchdown. They've learned that if their ego isn't serving the team, then it can destroy the team. If the ego isn't serving God or Spirit, or at least some higher purpose, it can wreak havoc in our own lives as well. The economic crisis is directly correlated to our financial institutions being run by egos without the benefit of having a higher purpose. And yet we are called and invited to exist to magnify, like Mary, some other higher power. To be able to point to something beyond ourselves, to something that is of greater good, that we become dedicated to, with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind. It is this capacity to magnify God by giving ourselves to a transcendent project that enables you and I on this day to be able to identify with Mary. You see, we have an animal nature, but we also have a spiritual nature, both of which are necessary and are good. But what the story of this virgin birth is about is an affirmation that there is a sacred space within every one of us reserved for the Spirit. No thing and nobody else can fill it. It is pure and it is chaste in the sense that it remains untouched by adventures and appetites of our wayward egos. You see, the way I see it and understand it is that we are all virgins in the sense that the touch that stirs us most deeply, that which brings forth our unique human potential to be vessels of divine creativity, is the touch of sacred mystery. It is the seduction of the Spirit that causes us to realize our higher purpose of giving birth to the sacred. And when we consent to the touch of God and agree to be vessels to give birth to the Christ, we know something of what it means then to truly be a Virgin Mary. Mary enjoys what scholars have referred to as a kenotic spirituality. Kenosis means to empty one's self, to give oneself, to pour oneself out. It is the opposite of storing up and filling up. In the Magnificat, and in response to the angel who announces her pregnancy, Mary creates space for God. Let it be to me according to your word. And the divine fills her up in this Christmas drama, literally and metaphorically. And then she delivers the divine in the baby Jesus. This is the kenotic pattern. We don't seek out experiences of God in order to feel more substantial or more holy or more enlightened in our lives. Rather, God bubbles up from within and fills the vessel that is our soul, and then we are invited to pour it back out, all that divinity, into the world. Filling up, spilling over. It's like an endless waterfall when it happens. It's how singer-songwriter Chris Williamson puts it. Some of you here today may remember the film Babette's Feast. It's a very simple, beautiful story about a celebrated chef in Paris during the riots of 1871. She loses everything in her life: her restaurant, her money, and her family. She takes refuge in a very austere religious community in Denmark. This community is on the verge of collapsing, and its remaining members are very old and they're very cranky. Out of the blue, she receives a package informing her that she has won the lottery. She makes a decision right then and there on the spot. And that is what she's going to do, is to use to create a feast for this religious community. One that they had never ever seen before. She orders in all of the gourmet food, the cutlery, oh man, the finest French wine, and the linen. The day the banquet arrives and they all sit down for the meal with very stern and disapproving faces at this extravagance. I've seen faces like that. It takes time, but slowly as one course is served and the other is presented, and the fine wine is consumed, the faces of the Christians begin to soften. One of them accidentally smiles before he can catch himself. Eventually, the joy begins to spread around the entire table, and they are sure that they are experiencing a foretaste of heaven's banquet. And when it's over, one of them asks Babette if she will be returning to Paris soon, now that she has acquired all of her fortune. "What fortune?" she responds. "Why, I spent all 3 million francs on this banquet, filling up and spilling over." Babette had delivered the divine. She sung her Magnificat. Her soul glorified the Lord. We sing the Magnificat by pouring ourselves out for the betterment of the world we live in. For God so loved the world, remember it said in John's Gospel, that God gave. This self-emptying, I hope you have gathered by now, is different, very different than any obligatory sacrifice. Rather, it is an outpouring of love. Love in, love out. Space created, love rushes in, love pours out. That is the true nature of the Holy One. And we, each of us, have been made in that image. It's the secret way of knowing joy. The unhealthy ego gets in the way of this cycle of filling up and spilling over. Much of our spiritual journey is simply about finding out how one's unhealthy ego has inserted itself like a dam to prevent this eternal flow, and then removing the obstacles. Easier said than done? I know, but not impossible. As Mary says, with God all things are possible. So I'll end this morning with this observance about the Magnificat. I never, in fact, liked the line in the song that sends the rich empty away. The poor are filled with good things, but the rich get their comeuppance. This is how I had always interpreted the passage, a kind of reversal of the social order. I probably, though, didn't like it because I identified with the rich who were sent away from the table in shame. But through this kenotic lens, I have discovered that the rich actually received a blessing. They are sent empty away, empty vessels. They came to the table stuffed full of all things that the world had to offer, but there was no room for the Spirit. And yet at Christ's table, they received the grace to release their attachment to all of this stuff and to recover the gift of holy emptiness, through which all blessings flow and the Christ can be born. May it be so for you this Christmas, and may it be so for me.